Hi, everyone. This is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. We're talking about donor stewardship today and how to get outside the box and make sure our stewardship is really kind of something that donors are going to respond to. We're going to give everyone just one more minute here to hop online. We have quite a few folks joining, so we're going to give everyone just one more minute, then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of y'all who just hopped on, my name is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. We're talking about donor stewardship today and how to make sure we're doing stewardship that really connects with our donors. A couple things to note for beginning. You should be able to see our screen right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either of those days, just let us know. We'll try to address those as quickly as we can. If you have any questions throughout the day, feel free to ask those anytime. We'll answer those questions as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. We will send out a copy of the slides and recording shortly afterwards, so you will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar today. Along with those slides, you'll also receive a very short, less than a minute long evaluation. Really appreciate you taking the time to fill it out as well. So thinking about donor stewardship, this is a great time of year to be thinking about stewardship, and glad to see that folks were interested in it, because often we think about this time of year, obviously in the nonprofit sector, as a time of solicitation, right? A time of asking for gifts, which is 100% is. We know that over 40% of nonprofit revenue is raised during the months of November and December. We know a good chunk of that is raised during the last 2 weeks of December. So it really is the busiest time of the year in terms of giving, which also means it's the busiest time of the year in terms of asking from our perspective. But at the same time, we want to proactively be thinking about stewardship here, both for what we can do in the moment to thank donors as they give during this busy season, and two, what we can do throughout the year, but especially the beginning of the calendar year, to thank donors meaningfully so they know those gifts matter. We'll talk about some specific tips today here in just a second, but I'm going to stay here on the title slide for just a moment as we think about the context we're entering into this conversation with where donors are right now. So one trend you've probably heard us say before, which is definitely still true, and we see it only increasing right now, is that individual donations look good from a net number, from a total number, but we actually see that being driven largely by major donors. So major donors are giving as much, if not more than ever before, and that is making up for the fact that grassroots and middle level donors are actually dropping out pretty aggressively. As folks have some economic uncertainty when they look to 2023, as inflation has hit them for prolonged periods of time, as they're no longer receiving any type of pandemic stimulus checks, etc. We're really seeing a lot of those kind of lower level donors drop out, and giving really be driven by those top level donors. This isn't going to be true for every organization, but this is the trend we're seeing at the national and kind of regional level, and something to be aware of. So in that environment, stewardship becomes even more important, right? As our giving is concentrated in fewer and fewer people, it becomes more and more important we retain those folks and keep them giving to us. It also means that for those new donors we have entering at lower levels, they're going to be few and far between, right? So it's going to be really important we also are engaging those new donors in a way that we can keep them, because we know it's kind of fighting against a trend in the space right The other thing I wanted to mention is that on that topic of donor retention, right, the national donor retention rate is about 47, 48%, the lowest it's been in the last 5, 10 years. And when we look at that, again, that means that about 47, 48% of donors who gave to a specific nonprofit last year would give again to that nonprofit this year, right? Which means 53% who gave last year would not be giving to that same nonprofit this year. Small nonprofits do better than that, right? So that's a national average. That's including things like your Red Crosses, your Big Brothers Big Sisters, right? These big nonprofits that have huge list of donors that often come and go year over year, right? So that rate is a little artificially suppressed because of that. But even when we think about this from a smaller nonprofit perspective, obviously a third of donors, if not more, are leaving on average for most organizations. And why is that happening? Over half of those donors, about 2/3, that stop giving to a nonprofit, say it's because they either feel like they don't matter or their gift didn't matter, right? So the majority of the people who stop giving to the organization, it's not because they moved, it's not because financial situation greatly changed, it's not because of a personal issue, it's directly their relationship with the nonprofit for the majority of them. Feel like they didn't matter or their gift didn't matter. So it's really important when we think about the stewardship issue, as retention has never been both more challenging and more important than it is now, how we build that relationship that donors know they matter and their gift makes a difference. So with that, we'll talk about 5 specific tips today on this. And the first one here is really thinking about your messaging across all your stewardship channels. So we'll spend some time a little later in the webinar talking about how we actually do the stewardship, right? Like, are we doing calls, meetings, virtual events, et cetera? So we'll talk about all that here in a second. But first, just thinking about your messaging overall. It's really important we think about what's going to help any of our stewardship notes, no matter how we send them, stand out to donors. And the first is that they're authentic. And this is actually probably the biggest, if there's one takeaway from today that we're seeing, is that those kind of tried and true, templatized kind of corporate thank you letters that a lot of folks kind of end up sending out really are not getting the job done anymore. Donors, even major donors, are really looking for more of a personal touch, and not that in any way are we customizing every thank you letter for a donor, but that it feels real. It feels like a real person wrote it at the beginning, even though they ultimately know it's obviously being used for all or most of the gifts. So really think about, and we'll talk more about this specifically in the thank you letter, et cetera, here in just a minute. But really want to make sure we use a motive language, personal language. Have the thank you letter come from someone, not from the organization, right? So the Catalog for Philanthropy doesn't thank you for your gift. Matt thanks you for your gift to the Catalog for Philanthropy, right? So we want it to be person to person, want to be a motive, want to be specific about why we're thankful, what we're thankful for, right? What we're going to do with the gift, and go beyond those kind of platitudes that people are kind of used to seeing there. And again, we'll dive deeper into that here in a minute. One thing that's helpful sometimes is folks don't really know how their stewardship efforts are being received. A great option for this is to ask people. So especially your donors who have been there for a long time, ask them like, hey, do you read that thank you letter we send out, right? If so, any thoughts on it, right? We can get some feedback from our existing donors. We can also look at things, right? Like open rates on thank yous that we send, right? Retention of donors who get different stewardship opportunities given to them. But doing a donor survey or doing some one-on-one kind of anecdotal questions there can be helpful. At the very least, getting feedback from someone who isn't the one writing the stewardship pieces. So even if it has to be internal and you don't feel like you have the donor relationships to ask, at least get program staff, a friend, a colleague outside the organization to take a look and make sure your message of gratitude is really getting across. And then finally, and we'll talk about some of the options for this here in just a minute, we want to make sure we're going a little outside the box. And that doesn't mean we have to do anything overly creative, definitely doesn't mean we have to do anything expensive, but it does mean we can't just have kind of a standard letter that we've used for 3 years in a row, just automatically go out to people and then think that's going to keep them engaged, right? We really want to think about what feels more personalized, what feels more direct, what feels more relational. So the second tip here, getting to that, is thinking about what are all the things we can do stewardship wise, so it's not just the typical thank you letter. This is in no way knocking a thank you letter. Thank you letter is the bread and butter, right? The foundation of our stewardship program. A lot of times we'll talk about tips on a thank you letter here in just a second. We'll also talk about a second year capacity. It's easy to look at a slide like this or others similar to it and feel like, well, I don't have time to do anything, so I'm not going to be able to do any of this. But we do see even small development shops, even organizations without any development staff, half of our partners have no development staff, still able to put these things into practice. They just may have to do so at a small scale to begin with. So we can talk about that as well here in a second. But some of those ideas, thinking about our stewardship in kind of two buckets, right? So one is private, which means one-on-one, right? We are individually thanking a donor in a way that only that donor is going to see. The other is public recognition, right? We're thanking that donor in a venue or avenue or method that other folks might also see, right? Both of these can be helpful, and we want to make sure we have a mix of these. Some donors are going to be really motivated by the public side of this. Others are going to want to avoid that at all costs, and they want to stay anonymous, right? They want to stay on the private side. And most donors are going to be open to both, right? We're going to have a few that are really motivated by one or the other. So on the private side, right, this is how we think about stewardship classically. It's some of those one-on-one ways where we're reaching out. So actively doing this, right, where we're actually engaging with them. Could be in-person coffee, right? We could be doing a Zoom call, could just be a phone call. I've had a lot of questions from organizations by at this point in kind of the pandemic, post-pandemic, kind of wherever we are. What should we be doing with donors in terms of that, in-person, phone, or Zoom? And we've just started saying that you really should give the donor the option, right? So the same as we used to always give donors an option about like where you want to go to lunch, right? Or lunch or coffee. Now it's really giving them just those three options, preferably a Zoom or an in-person meeting. In terms of the relational engagement, we see in-person be best, Zoom be second, and phone be third. But whatever is going to get that conversation to happen with the donor is the option we should go with there, right? So letting them kind of choose there and choose at their own comfort level. So that's obviously the active kind of version of that, and that's going to be really reserved, especially in person, for our higher level donors. Right. We're going to be using that for our major donors, our significant middle level donors who have been with us for a while. Zoom, though, does give us the possibility of working a little deeper on our list, right? Because it's less both cost and time to do so. So while in-person meetings will probably always be reserved for just our highest level donors, those Zoom calls might be able to get us one layer down, right? Maybe our lower major donors, higher middle level, and phone calls might even get us a level below that down to our middle level donors. Passive, and that may sound negative, but all passive means here is that you're not actively doing something while the thanking is happening, while the gratitude is being shared with the donor. So this could be sending an email thank you, right? Sending a thank you letter. We also see some people add on to that thank you letter and send, for instance, for first-time donors, which we know retention is worst for first-time donors, right? So first-time donors are the donors that are most likely to not give to you the next year, because they have the least relationship with you. Sending like a welcome package, right? Could be a little swag, could be a couple additional notes, maybe some photos, and invite to an event. But we have seen some nonprofits start doing that because we see the majority of donors, if you get them to give 2 years in a row, they then will stay with you unless something happens. So the big hurdle is often getting them to that year 2. So moving from private to public here on the public side, actively, this will be hosting a stewardship event. I know it sounds expensive. We'll talk more about this in a second. Doesn't have to be. These can be super easy, really low cost. They can be virtual or in person, at town hall as well. And this is just a chance to share some targeted information about the organization and say thank you in a targeted way while building more of a network and sense of community. We hear from donors time and time again right now, they're looking for a sense of community within their giving, and this can be an easy way to do that. But we'll talk more about stewardship events here in just a minute. And then passively, publicly, this could be things like listing supporters on the website, right, in the annual report, in the major publications we do, sponsors at events. It could be making a thank you video. We've seen more organizations start doing this, where the executive director will film a quick 20, 30-second video, right, thanking donors, and that's attached to some emails, maybe post it on social media. And again, it's an easy way to thank folks that's a little bit different. Third tip is back to, again, that tried and true stewardship technique of the thank you letter, right? And the thank you letter is just as critical as ever, if not more so right now. But we really want to make sure that it's being useful, right? So if we write a thank you letter, send it, and no one reads it, or no one really engages with it, it's not going to make a big difference, right? So we want to make sure that's as engaging as possible. So a couple of things we want to do there. One, and this sounds obvious, but we actually see it happen less often than you would expect, making sure we thank the donor directly in the thank you letter. So a lot of times we say things like, the gift means a lot to us, we appreciate this, right? Our donors are critical to our success. But we really want to make sure that specifically we're saying thank you for making this gift, and we're directly giving them appreciation at least twice in the letter. Often once at the beginning, once at the end. So if they take nothing else away, they're taking that gratitude and appreciation away. In the middle of those kind of sections of kind of personal gratitude that you have for the donor and their behavior there, you want to sketch the impact the gift is going to make, right? So really let them know what's going to happen because of this. We can't necessarily often say, hey, your $10 is going to directly do X, Y, or Z. So your $10 is going to go towards this type of programming. Here's a quick anecdote, impact story, right? Stat, et cetera, related to that work. Helping them understand how their donation is going to fit into that bigger piece of the puzzle, really important there. And then finally, this might seem obvious again, but we see it happen more often than it should, which is that the thank you letter is used as an ask again. I want to make sure we avoid this at all. We want nothing in the thank you letter to seem like we're asking for more. We want this to purely be a message of gratitude. We'll talk about how to later use stewardship to start that donor cycle up again, right, of getting them to give and cultivate, etc. But this first thank you letter, we want just to be gratitude. One other thing to note here, donors that stop giving, right, stop giving because either they feel like their gift didn't make a difference or they weren't appreciated, right, that they didn't feel like they mattered to the organization. So the gift making a difference part is addressed by the sketching the impact, right? We want them to know their gift does indeed matter. But the other part about them being appreciated, that's really on that first and last part of the thank you letter, which is that direct thanking and appreciation. We want them to know that not only do we appreciate their gift, we appreciate them, and we appreciate their decision to give. So that's separate, right, than the gift itself. We appreciate the gift. The gift is going to be helpful. It's going to do great stuff. But we also want to make sure that they understand that we appreciate their decision and their choice to give, right? Want to elevate that. That helps the donor feel a certain way about themselves, right? It gives them a sense of identity, and we know donor identity is really important in terms of retention and loyalty to the brand. And it also lets them know that they matter, right? It's not just we care about their money. A couple good times to send this. We obviously want to send it right after the gift. Best practice would be within a week, week and a half of receiving the gift. For a lot of us, that may not be possible capacity-wise, given our size of our development teams or lack thereof. So wherever you are right now in terms of when you send thank you letters, just set a goal to get more systemized and a little more efficient. So if you don't have a process or kind of goal right now, setting it that, within a month of the gift, you're going to send a thank you letter is a great place to start. Work your way to 2 weeks and then eventually get to a week, week and a half, which is, again, that kind of top standard in the field. Sending a thank you letter, not just when the gift happens, is a great way to make that thank you letter stand out. Everyone expects a thank you letter right after the gift. If you don't send, it's going to stand out negatively. But we could also, though, send it, for instance, during the holidays, right? During our organization's anniversary, on that donor's birthday, right? Telling them happy birthday and also thank you for giving. And especially on their giving anniversary. So the 1-year anniversary, the 5-year anniversary, when they made their first gift, that's a great way to thank people for their support. We had a question about how often should I be updating my thank you letter. That's a great question. Again, it's a little bit of capacity challenge, but we want to make sure that at least once a year, right? So if my donors only give once a year, they only give in December, I don't want them to see the same thank you letter as last year. They may not consciously remember it's the same one. Honestly, we could probably run it back and they wouldn't notice it. But It's going to be less engaging. It's going to be less fresh, right? The tone's probably changed a little bit. The world's definitely different than it was a year ago. So I want to make sure I'm updating that and keeping that kind of fresh, updated, kind of to the moment. It's both going to be more engaging now and also avoids the risk of them feeling like we're just running the same letter back out there every year. The fourth tips around timing. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but trying to get thank you letter out right as soon as possible. Again, whatever that means for you right now in terms of capacity. Secondly, thinking about the first 90 days after a gift is made. So every time someone gives to you, even if they've been giving for a long time, the 90 days after that transaction, right, after that gift is made, is basically your time to influence the relationship. After those 90 days, they kind of become set again until they kind of give again. So I want to think about during those 90 days, building towards this. I know we may not have capacity to do this right now, but building towards a world in which we're sending a thank you right after their gift, letting them know how much we appreciate it and the impact it's going to make. We send another one about 4 to 6 weeks later, telling them, hey, we still remember, right? We appreciate that gift before, and here's a couple other impact stories about how that's going to make a difference. Then finally sending a note about 90 days after, 3 months later, telling them thank you, telling them some of the things going on, and inviting them to something. Could be to volunteer, attend an event, etc. It shouldn't be a financial ask, but inviting them to get involved, sign up for a newsletter, do something with the organization. So that 3-tier thank you process is what we see best drives retention. We know it's not reasonable or possible for every organization right off the bat, but it's something to work towards. And even if it's only 2 touch points, even if it's just the right away in the 90-day, or you to combine all those messages in the one that you send a month later because of capacity. But those are the 3 touch points and 3 messages we see best drives donor retention. And then finally, as we mentioned on the previous slide, those giving anniversaries are a great time to send a card to folks. They're not expecting it. And the biggest thing about stewardship right now is doing something that's not expected, right? That's still easy, simple for us to kind of pull off, but we'll send out to the donor. And then the 5th tip here, building your matrix. So this is, again, talking about, we talked about a lot of ways, and there's many more than what we've discussed, how you could thank your donors. So what are we going to decide to actually do, right? So building a matrix is just, you can use an Excel with just some rows and columns. Basically, however you set it up, it could be either way, but let's say your columns are the different amount of gifts you get, right? So less than $100, 100 to 500, 500, 1,000, 1,000 and above, right? So you have 3 or 4 columns there. And then the rows are the different things you could do, right? Send a printed thank you letter, email a thank you letter, have an in-person meeting with the ED, have an in-person meeting with another member of staff, get a phone call, etc., right? So whatever those might be for us. And then we want to check off that at those different giving levels, which of those different stewardship activities will they get, right? So this is a guide for us that when then we get that $275 gift in the door, we roughly know what we're supposed to do there. This will be true for 80 or 90% of our donors. There's always special cases, right, where some reason we want to go meet with them even though they gave less because we know they could give more, or they give a lot but they don't want to be bothered, so we don't do as much. But for 80 or 90% of our donors, this matrix will help kind of guide our actions there. We want to make sure we're getting feedback on this so we don't just decide this and then never get feedback from donors. So after we've done this for 6 or 12 months, it'd be a great time to get some feedback from a donor survey or some anecdotal conversations. And then finally, the biggest thing here on this is being realistic, right? So it's better to set a few things you can do, get good at doing that, then add more, than set like, we're going to get lunch with every donor that gives $100, not be able to do it. We then kind of don't take it seriously anymore, and then we don't hold ourselves accountable to it, right? So we want to make sure we're setting realistic goals for our stewardship there. Then the last piece we'll talk about before we pause for any questions y'all have is thinking about kind of a stewardship event, right? So we called this a shareholder update. So we saw some nonprofits doing this over the last few years and actually got some really great engagement and success with this. But I was really just thinking through, how can we share some info to donors and make them feel more engaged as a result, right? So thinking about how we make them feel the gratitude we have, but also higher levels of engagement. So we can do this virtually or in person. We saw this work really well virtually, but we also know virtual engagement's down a little bit right now, although we expect that to rally in 2023 as people have had a little break from their screens. So if you're doing this in person, I would cap that more to like 20, 25 people. If you're doing it virtually, you have more like 50 folks on the call. I want to give a sense that this is an exclusive invite, right? We want you here because you're a supporter of the organization, you matter to the organization, etc. Ask for an RSVP, right? So it feels legit to them and they feel like they need to be there. And we really want to keep kind of the main points of this kind of presentation update, in person or virtual, to just a few things, right? So focusing on something we did recently in the community through our work, right? So they know that impact is happening right now. Focus on at least one thing that's coming up so they have a reason to stay engaged and be excited. And then one thing that's either about the team, organization, or the community, right? So one kind of development, fun fact, new thing, challenge, opportunity, etc. That's happening in the community or internal to the organization. We want that presentation piece, if it's in person, to be kind of 20 minutes or less, 15 minutes or less. If it's virtual, we want that presentation piece and probably the whole event itself to be about 45 minutes or less. If it's in person, the one thing we won't do virtually, is we'll add a networking piece to this, right? So like, cocktails, glasses of wine, whatever. People are able to walk around, connect with each other. Because the goal of doing this in person is that they really get a sense of connection with each other. So they want to be a part of this community moving forward and they hear this information. If it's virtual, it's mainly that they hear us saying thank you and learn a little more about the organization. So a couple of next steps before we pause for any questions. This is a great time to think of donors to thank, right? Because again, most donors are getting just hit with solicitation after solicitation. So as our donors have given, if we're able to thank them during this time, those thank you messages stand out. Thinking about what are 2 to 3 virtual or in-person stewardship events we could do in 2023. Again, these can be very simple, very easy, but covering a little bit of information while also saying thank you and building some community. Thinking about how to involve board or staff, right? This doesn't have to be just us doing this, and actually it can benefit from having board or staff involved. Thinking about what we can make ahead of time so that during busy thank you times, like it's coming up in January, we already have the resources ready. If we have materials that we used in 2021, we haven't updated them yet, I want to make sure we update for our end of year donors and as well as we move into 2023. And then finally, think through stewardship through May, right? So the first quarter of the year, first 5 months of the year are often a little slower for development unless we have a fundraising event. So it's a really great time to do a lot of relationship building, cultivation, etc. So I want to think through what our plan is for next few months. With that, I'll pause and take any questions you all have for a wrap up. Someone was asking how much is too much communication. We're always having conversations about potentially annoying donors with too much communication. What are your thoughts on something like that? So that's a great question. I will say donor fatigue, right? Donors being kind of frustrated by too much communication is a little bit of one of the like boogeyman of the development space, right? We're all worried about it, all thinking about it. But we see in the majority of cases, not every case, but the majority of cases, donors get frustrated by being asked for money too often, right? By being solicited too often, but rarely get tired of hearing from you. Most donors at this point, even some of our older donors, would like to hear from you or open to hear from you on a monthly basis. Every audience is different, right? If your audience skews kind of 70 and above, right? I would maybe aim for more like on a quarterly rate. But for most audiences these days, we see that monthly rate basis is a great opportunity. If there's some type of way they can engage 3 to 4 times across the year, right? So maybe that's a fundraising event or two, a cultivation event or two, a stewardship event or two. And they may not go to all that, right? And that's the thing, is that it may feel like a lot to us at some points, but most donors are only seeing about half of what we communicate, right? Between Gmail filters and just ignoring their email, right? Or not opening something we send. So maybe half on on a good year. So sending out something at least monthly, having kind of a quarterly opportunity to engage, all that is totally fine. And when it comes to kind of thinking initially in that 3-tier process, we see folks really appreciate the gratitude. So the majority of donors are open to that and respond well to that. Any other questions folks have? That was a great question. All right, great. Well, I'm not seeing anything else, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We'll send out slides and recording shortly afterwards, and thank you all for joining.